It is my privilege and my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Kimberly Makeski. She was for 20 years a biblical studies professor at Anderson College and is currently serving as the executive director of Christian Women Connection, which is a nonprofit that she heads up. And she is going to be talking to us about the Priscilla Catacombs. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. So I'm visiting Texas from Indianapolis. So thanks for having me. I like the cinnamon coffee. I've been here since Thursday last week. We had a conference in Dallas for the Wesleyan Holiness clergywomen. And so all over 800 women, pastors, professors, leaders gathered to worship and celebrate. And so we've been walking around with shirts with Magdalene and Priscilla and Phoebe and Dorcas and Chloe on them. And so you guys would have fit right in. So thanks to Dr. Lynn Coick for inviting me to hop over to Houston and be a part of this great conversation today. I have been sort of searching for Priscilla for about a decade. It started when I was doing some postgraduate work at the University of Notre Dame and just really started to have questions about what happened to these biblical women after the closing of the canon. Why is it that these women contributed so much to the early church, the early centuries, the stories and the Gospels, and then they seemingly just sort of fall off the map of history and are lost to us? And what I've come to find out is that's largely because of who was writing the history. And that what's true is that for people who were non-Roman, white, elite males, you didn't really get your story preserved. And so here we all are, all these centuries later, hungry, thirsty for stories of our mothers, to know what happened, to answer the question of what exactly is that space between Priscilla teaching Apollos and Phoebe taking the letter on behalf of Paul to Romans and exegeting, and all of these ways these women in the early church are leading, and then we don't hear about them into the ensuing centuries. What happens between that and then those pastoral letters that would say, women can't preach, women can't teach, and we have Dr. Glahn here to talk about that a little bit maybe later. But what exactly is that interplay in the story, and what is the narrative? And so I've been to Rome twice now to kind of search this out and crawl around in the catacombs. There actually happens to be several pieces of evidence of the life of this biblical Priscilla outside the canon, and some of those are buried in the catacombs, which is what I'm going to speak to you about specifically today. But to just refresh our memories, I'm speaking about Prisca or Priscilla, who is the wife of Aquila and who is the co-laborer of Paul. She is there together with her husband, and in the New Testament, she's named 6 times. And 4 of those 6 times, she's named before her husband. And because we think that Paul didn't really respect the conventions of the world inside the community, that there had to be specific reasons for why she was named first. And those are probably because she was more prominent or known more intimately in the community. And so 4 out of 6 times she's named first. We hear about her in different texts as Prisca or Priscilla. It's just like Kim and Kimberly, right? My mother calls me Kimberly, right? When I'm in trouble, and just every day it's Kim. So Priscilla is actually a diminutive of Prisca. So Prisca was the more formal way to use the name. And so we have these stories, these little snippets of her in the New Testament. We also have a codex, the Bodmer Codex, and a tiny little papyrus fragment that is still in existence that talks about she and Aquila being present with Paul after he has a resurrection appearance, his post-resurrection appearance in the Acts of Paul. And he presents himself to them in Ephesus after he's been wrestling with a tiger. Yeah. So then we have pieces of her footprints in texts like from Epiphanius in the 4th century. There is the Indices Apostolorum, where he goes through and names the bishops who come after the apostles, those people who are in leadership. And surprisingly, in that document, there is a Priscus named and a Junius named. So 2 of the names who are women leaders in the Pauline circle are named in this document of Epiphanius as bishops in the early church. Priscus, of course, the male form of the name, is mentioned as the bishop of Colophon near Ephesus, and Junius is mentioned as the bishop of Apamea in Syria. She's mentioned again in Chrysostom. She's remembered as a pillar of faith and someone whom we should look up to, a person who risked her neck, right, for the Gentiles. And then there are some martyr stories that are 7th, 8th century that talk about this Prisca. And sometimes there are stories of Prisca and Aquila being martyred in Africa. Sometimes they're martyred in Asia Minor. Sometimes there's stories that seem to not relate to them at all. But there's little traces of them throughout the early years that tell us people were connected to this couple, to this husband and wife, or to this wife and husband, if you like. They were connected to these leaders, and they had left their mark on the early Christian church. So I went to Rome because there's a church there called Santa Prisca. It's a titular church. Did you all visit when you were there? Okay, you have to put that on your itinerary if you have time between gelato. There's a lot of gelato to do. There's a titular church, and we'll talk about that. And so I visited that and did some research there. But there's also in Rome the Priscilla's Catacombs. And so I wanted to know about what was the connection between this catacomb named Priscilla and my Priscilla, the one that is in the biblical text that I'd been searching for so long. And when I tell you that I went into that subterranean world and saw these images, that I just felt so compelled that there was a connection, that I was looking at images of her story. It was profound to me. Now, I'd brought with me all kinds of bias. I wanted to find her. I'm a woman clergy, right? I've been looking for her for a long time. I had taken my sabbatical to come study her, so I am stating my bias, right? As historians, we just have to say it. We have to state our bias before we practice. And so I went in there looking for her. And when I saw these images, I felt very certain that I had seen her. I want to show you some of the images and talk to you a little bit about some of the excavations and what other folks have thought through the centuries and see what you think. All right, so on one of the monuments that's found in the tomb in the late 19th century by a guy named Giovanni Battista de Rossi is this portion of a statue that was attached to a sarcophagus. And I loved this comment. I loved this little line. Someone has written about their loved one. La Aquila Prisca Clarimissima Puella ho femina. That's how good my Latin is. But it means she was a flame. She was a flame. This is a piece of epigraphy that was actually connected to Vera Priscilla and a 4th century artifact. But it's found within the catacomb by De Rossi, and he shared that. And I thought, what an important piece of the puzzle as we sort of put together all of these little notches. So I don't know if you can see that very well. When we talk about the excavations of the Priscilla's catacombs, it really kind of is left to 3 big names or 3 big pushes that happen. In the early days, the catacombs are, I guess I could pull up my paper, but I haven't even, let me just go ahead. In the early days, what happens is the catacombs become places where Romans bury their dead. In the 2nd and 3rd century, this becomes really important practice, the interment of bodies. And since before 450 BCE, they're not allowed to bury their bodies inside the city. So they go outside the city walls to do that. And the catacombs originate in these rock quarries in the tufa rock underneath the city there on the outskirts. And they become sort of co-opted by wealthy families, and by the 3rd century, really the church has taken an interest into overseeing and being responsible for the care and keeping of the catacombs. Now, it's been thought for years, and the reason is because some of the early archaeologists said it, but we no longer think that early Christians hid out there in the catacombs to escape persecution. What's true is the catacombs were places where early Christians and Romans visited their dead. So it'd be very much today how maybe you visit your loved one in a cemetery and bring flowers on their birthday, or take a Christmas tree at the holidays. The early Christians and Romans certainly did this, but it was very in depth. We have, and I'll show you in just a minute, evidences that they, took meals there. There are dining tables and benches, and you kind of go and hang out and feast in the presence of those who you've loved, who've passed on to the afterlife. And this is a really important part of their communal life together. And one of the ways that I think they still feel connected to those people who have gone on to the next life. And so these catacombs are precious, of course, to the families who own them. They largely become the property of wealthy families and estates, and then the church by the 3rd century. Then there's the onslaught of the Gothic invaders in Rome, and they fall into ruins. And the faithful are really, really worried about the relics and the bones of the martyrs in the catacombs and getting them out and transferred to the churches where they'll be more protected. And they lie there kind of just in disrepair for centuries and centuries and centuries. We do know that in the 6th century, I think about 535 is the last time anyone is buried in the Roman environs of the catacombs. So that doesn't happen anymore after that time. What happens is after the city is sort of restored to peace, the faithful begin to visit the sites where the martyrs have been buried, where their bones have been preserved. And because it's not, they're not able to travel to Jerusalem on pilgrimage anymore, what happens is those pilgrimages now come to Rome. And they visit the sites of these beloved people who have been killed in the name of faith. And so there are all these martyr itineraries. There are 3 major ones that exist today, still survived. And you can see the names of the martyrs and how you would come into the city and you would go counterclockwise around the roads and stop at all the different sites. Some of them tell you, she's buried out by this rock. But very primitive style, but guide you towards this sort of sacred passageway so that you could experience and connect with the martyrs. So the Catacomb of Priscilla is visited a couple times in the 15th century by people who de Rossi just believes are no good. A lot of folks who are able to get down into those places that have been covered over and are messed up do get pieces out and kind of stuffle them away, sell them on the market, those kind of things. De Rossi feels very angry towards those people. But it is in the 16th century and the Renaissance, we heard about earlier, that Antonio Bossio is the first person who really becomes interested in visiting and figuring out what's happening in these catacombs. And he is kind of dismissed. I don't want to say dismissed, but he is not appreciated as much by archaeologists today in terms of his process, because he's guided very much by the Acts of the Martyrs and the itineraries and what he knows about the folks who have been killed. He writes his Roman Soterrena, and it's published after he's dead. It's 5 books long, and it's what a way to spend your Friday night. But he goes just painstakingly through talking about what happens to these bones and these bodies. And but it is important for him that where they are and how they've been remembered and all the little etchings on the walls gets handed down to us. And you can imagine this Antonio Bossio in the 16th century crawling on his hands and knees with a taper candle in these narrow passageways, moving rocks out of the way so that he can look up at things on the ceiling and on the sides. So I don't think we ought to be too harsh on him. But he'd have these experiences where he would see an image, and in one case he is in the cubicula of the Velata, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and he sees this woman, and he comes home, and he says, "I know that was Priscilla, because today is her feast day." And that feels a little bit itchy to modern archaeologists. Like, that doesn't feel like good, solid science. But he felt so profoundly like he saw that and experienced that in her catacomb, or a catacomb named Priscilla on her feast day. And so that must be profound. It's not really until the 19th century and Giovanni Battista de Rossi and his excavations become underway that we really get some good information about what is in the catacombs. And they're very primitive drawings, and you can hardly see this on the sketch here. I'm sorry. But if you can kind of make out here, what we have is the word Domina Priscilla. And so de Rossi did all sorts of excavation in the space. He spends years down there, and he is able to locate what he thinks is the most ancient part of the catacomb. and sort of the nucleus of how it began. And he attributes that to the area of where the original family was buried. And that original family is the Achillei Glabrione. And so this is a partial map of the catacomb of Priscilla. So I want you to understand this is just half of it. We're talking about 3 miles and 3 stories of catacombs. Of the more than 60 catacombs in Rome, Priscilla's is the largest of all of them. And so this is taken from his Roman Soteriana Christiana. There's 3 of them, right? So Basio writes one, De Rossi writes one, and then Wilpert writes one. So that's not confusing at all. But this is De Rossi's, and he maps out for us the catacombs. And he says that in the very most ancient part of the catacombs is all sorts of evidences for the family of the Achillei Glabriones. And in the family Achillei Glabriones, the name Priscilla is prevalent. So I don't know if you have been named after your mother, or you have the same middle name as your mother or your grandmother or something. But in the ancient world, this was very, very prevalent. And so apparently in this particular family, they liked the name Priscilla because there are just all sorts of Priscillas. There's a Priscilla who is the wife of Manius Glabio, and he is one of the consuls in year 156. There are indications that there was a mother and daughter buried there side by side who are both Priscilla in that catacomb. There is the 4th century Vera Priscilla that I told you about. She was a flame. There is the martyr Priscilla that he also believes was buried there, and we'll speak about her in a minute. But he thinks that the person that this catacomb was named for was Priscilla, the noblewoman, who was mother of Pudens and grandmother to Praesede and Pudenziana. Did you visit those churches when you were in Rome? Some of the most beautiful, right? And so Praesede and Pudenziana, you just have to forgive my Italian Latin. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and I just barely got through Greek and Hebrew. I've taught it for years, but it sounds Southern. You can't do it. I just slaughter it. This beautiful Italian language. And I can say allora, right? Say that in Rome. It sounds like you fit in. Okay. Anyway, so he thinks that this is the mother of Pudens, grandmother to Pudenziana and Praesede. These are women who are remembered as caring for the martyrs and their remains after they face the beasts. And if you've been to their chapels, they're so beautiful and so important and so rich with relics and connection to the stories. So all of this is one family. And De Rossi contends that they're all related, that this estate was owned by the Achillei Glabrione family, and this is where they buried their dead. And that's why we find all these Priscilla throughout. But he would also say that it's not just these Priscillas. He thinks that the martyr itineraries that date to the 7th and 8th century that talk about the visitors who come there are concerned with perhaps the martyr Prisca. There's a young 13-year-old girl who is beheaded and in the very early stories, and he believes she's been laid to rest there too, because it is without a doubt certain that people who were buried in this part of the catacomb are beloved and were seen as important. And then the other contention that he holds is that this family is connected to the Aquila and Priscilla of Scripture. That they originated there, that they were buried there, and that they're transferred by Leo IV in the 8th century and moved to the titular church on the Aventine for her name. And so all of those connections exist in the backdrop as we now look at some of the beautiful art. This is the Capella Greca, or the Greek chapel, and it's off this major atrium area that we have. And there are a couple things to notice here. I don't know if you went to any of the catacombs while you were getting gelato, but in the Priscilla's catacombs, you'll see the dark sort of Cinnabon color, they call it. Cinnabar, not Cinnabon. Cinnabar color, this dark sort of red-brown. This is consistent with what we call the first Roman style. And this is the same kind of medium that was used at Pompeii. So if you visit Pompeii and you see those frescoes there, you'll note it's the same kind of work. It comes from the same period. And this isn't true in all the catacombs, but this tells us that this is very, very old. So we have here, as we come into the Greek chapel, you'll notice here on the side is a very narrow bench. And so De Rossi, Bossio, Wilpert, they all agree that this was a space where people gathered. There was likely a martyr here or somebody very important, because it was obvious that this particular space, the Greek chapel and the atrium outside, were built so that they could house people who had come to gather. We also have accounts from a 3rd century bishop that talks about having people take mass in the Priscilla's catacombs. So we know that that was a practice that happened. And I want you to notice that the art on the walls is sometimes very hard to see. I'm going to show you some renderings from Joseph Wilpert's watercolors in just a moment, and they are much more clear. But what's compelling for us is that so many of these images, particularly in this part of the catacomb, the Greek chapel and then the cubicum of the Vellata, are very feminine in nature. So this particular image is referred to as Susanna, and the apocryphal story, you know, of Susanna. And so this is talked about as Susanna and the elders. This is there in the catacomb in the Greek chapel. And then we have this incredible painting at the very end. And what I want to say is, if we go back and kind of notice the way you process in, these are sort of stories of devoted life and practice for the faithful. And then you pass into here, and these images would depict stories of sacrifice and observance. And then as you process out, the images are about resurrection. The final image that you see as you go out of the Greek chapel is the raising of Lazarus. And so there's an idea that you press in and you press out. And just as you were saying earlier, this, as you can see here, is the transept area, right? It's built like a cross inside to the Greek chapel. So along these sides are some images. We have Susanna over here, and then there's supposedly over here, this image is supposedly Daniel in the lion's den. I couldn't get a good image of that to show you, but Nicola Dinsey Lewis argues that it's not Daniel at all, that it's more likely that it is Thecla, because it's a seemingly feminine image, and it fits more readily with the other images of the space. Priscilla's catacomb also has the oldest known relief of the Madonna and Child, dating to the late 2nd or 3rd century CE. And that's it there. You can kind of see the stars above her head. This is the baby here. This with the prophet there beside her. So that's very, very old, and the oldest known image we have. This is what we call Cooper's markings. You can see throughout the catacomb places where people who worked there, who were helping scoop out, who were helping transfer parts, left their names and wanted us to know they were there. And then next door to the Greek chapel, so adjacent to it, is the cubiculum of the Velata. And I don't know if you can see here, but in the catacombs, there are all these loculi, these little slats, right, where the remains would be kept and sort of plastered in. This is just on the other side of the Greek chapel, so next door to the Greek chapel. And in 2013, Google Maps partnered with the Vatican. And as you can imagine, that just went swimmingly well. But all of a sudden, you could go, and if I could pull it up here now, I could show you, but you can go to the website of the Priscilla's Catacombs, and you can go under the street and into the catacombs, and you can see the Greek chapel and some of the other images that we've talked about. You cannot see this anymore, because in 2013, they released these images, and they said, come on in, Google Maps. And all the feminist Bible scholars and theologians went crazy, because we now had, on top of the Fractioponis, which we'll speak about, this image here of this veiled woman with her hands up into the air, which is the orante pose, right? She's praying with a veil over her head. And so they said, well, in the Fractioponis, we've got women observing Eucharist. And then in the veiled women, we've got women lifting their hands and evangelizing and preaching. And while many feminist scholars were excited about that, the Vatican sadly was not. And somehow that little click that got you over into the cubiculum of the Velata got turned off, and now you can only see the Greek chapel. A word about the Fractioponis. This has been, just a really important piece for many, many years, and in discussions about who is sitting at this table. Are these men? Are these women? What are they doing? I have a better image of it from Wilpert's Wind Rings that I'm going to show you in just a minute. But it depends on, if you take the tour guide from upstairs in the Benedictine chapel as your guide down into the catacombs, he would tell you there's no women here. These are men, because it's the Eucharist, and only men could serve the Eucharist. If you take someone who's a guide, I had a friend who was a PhD who went down with us and, said, these are obviously women. There's upswept hair, and you can see here on the other image when I show you the longer skirts. These look like feminine faces, not male faces. And now the pushback from the Vatican will say, well, maybe it is, but it's obviously not a Eucharistic meal. And, we're just kicking it up, right? It's happy hour. But it makes sense. Actually, funerary feasts are one of the most featured artistic depictions in all of the catacombs. And so we could imagine women, particularly, gathering in this space where a female martyr has been laid to rest, to come and worship and sing prayers and songs, and to share a meal and to be close to her presence and to gain strength for each other, from each other and from her presence before they go out into the light. And so when we come to the cubiculum of the Velata, you have to say, well, that's next door to the Fractio Panis. And this has these beautiful 3 images. And so when I saw these three images, I thought, well, I have a story for what this is, right? So this is a woman with a child. I must be getting an email. This is a woman with a child. And this is a husband and wife. It may be a marriage ceremony or a ordination ceremony or consecration ceremony of there. Wilpert and Bosio and de Rossi all refer to this as the Virgin. And then this, the veiled woman. We were hearing about earlier, this way she's looking upward is very important. Her hands are very big. It's being emphasized to us that she's praying. And Dr. Kowick and I have talked about this image. And when I see this image, all I can think about is 1 Corinthians 11 and praying in public with your head covered. So again, I bring all of this with me as I'm coming down there, belly full of gelato, to see this. And I think, well, that looks like Priscilla's life to me, right? That she's married to Aquila, and that was a really important tableau from her life, and that she's this incredible preacher and teacher and leader in the early church, and that maybe she has a child, and that child is also named Priscilla, and that is how the line continues into the family. This just kind of shows you another photo up close. Joseph Wilpert is the student of de Rossi who will go in after de Rossi, and he's really an artist. And what he's able to do is to take these images and offer them back to us in such vivid color and beauty that it's remarkable. When I went from seeing them in person to seeing his drawings, I felt like someone turned the lights on, right? So beautiful. what he's been able to offer here. So as you can see, this is just a picture of the woman with the child. And then another that he did of the woman, the veiled woman. And then the man and a woman in the consecration. So some have said maybe this is the Apostle Paul giving a blessing to Priscilla and Aquila before their ministry. Some people have said this is a marriage ceremony. Some people don't want to talk about that at all. So this was open and kind of got pushed out into the world in 2013. And then everybody went crazy and excited. And that's my battery going dead, and I have more to show you. Everybody went crazy and was super excited about that. And then that was problematic for the Vatican. And so they opted to turn that off. Yeah. I mean, this is just the story of my life. It just goes there. And so now that has been opened back up. They've done some refurbishments on the different frescoes to kind of do some due diligence that needed to be done because the lighting affects them after so long. And you can now see the Cubiculum of Vellata. You can go in there, but it's no longer on Google Maps. You have to go down there with the guide, so the guide can tell you who these people are. And so I had said with my group above, we were in the chapel above, and I said, now listen, we are going down there, and I want you to look for the stories of our sisters, right? What do you see? What stands out to you? And we got downstairs, and he said, this is not the matron of the Catacombs, and this is not the biblical Prisca, and this is not the martyr Prisca. This is Jesus. And so that's the line now, that this is Jesus. But that, I'm not an art historian, but that feels problematic to me since just above her head is Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And so that feels different than this. Hits different, doesn't it? Yeah. And so we just have this this unbelievable treasure trove of images, female images, in this one specific area that we know was occupied by the Achillei Grabione family, that according to Bossio and De Rossi is where Aquila and Priscilla were initially buried. The martyr Prisca herself rested there at a time. The Dominus, who later gives her estate, is also named Priscilla. And that can get really murky unless there was this incredible woman who was a friend to the Apostle Paul and had a really prominent role in the early church. And she was so active in helping spread the message of the gospel that she actually instructed Apollos, pulled him over and said, well, let me help you figure that out. And she was so beloved, she and her husband, that the Apostle Paul said they risked their necks for the sake of the gospel, and that the whole Gentile church gave thanks for them. And that because she's so beloved and she was so important to what was happening in the church and in the story in those early days, that folks in her family line started to name their babies after her because they wanted them to grow up in her image and in her power and in her service to the Lord. And as the centuries progressed, you started to have a family that was just filled with Priscillas. And centuries later, you came along and you find this catacomb, this grave, this cemetery that's been digged and named Priscilla on this property that was owned by the Achillei Glabriones. And Achillei is just not so far from the word Aquila. And then you find all these pieces, parts of all these different Priscillas that lived across all these different times. And you have these martyr itineraries that tell you they came to see the one who served, was synergos with Paul, right? And you can imagine them gathering in this small little chapel on a narrow bench, not really big enough for a lot of men down there. And you have this image of women sitting around a dining table, breaking bread. Maybe they're telling stories and remembering what had gone before. And when you link all those pieces together, suddenly it doesn't sound so crazy. That maybe, just maybe, we've begun to uncover what happened to her after the stories of the Bible were closed. And maybe when we have to talk about what we know about her story and how it progressed, it's not as much reconstruction as it is discovery. Maybe we can use methods like Nadia Solomon's critical fabulation. She uses a Venus in 2 acts. This idea that women in the Middle Passage who died on the slave ships coming over no less lived, and that we owe them a debt to do what we can to know about the context out of which they came and tell their stories. And then it feels like this is the kind of thing we should do. Like get together in beautiful chapels and show the pictures and ask the questions and pull the threads and see what comes of it. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Oh, yeah, thank you. And I think, too, I think that's the way we tell stories. I mean, that's the way we got the Gospels, right? They're all just narratives. It's just these got dropped. And so we're a few centuries late to the game, but it feels important to keep putting the narratives out there and seeing if they stick. Yes? Thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So I would say she's named first in Scripture because she's prominent in the community of faith, not necessarily that she was prominent in Roman society. Does that make sense? Yes. Mm-hmm. And there are all kind of scenarios about him being a freed man, in the household because, you took on the names of the family. So that's another sermon. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I don't know if either of you have any expertise on. I haven't read anything about why those images are larger. Only to say that the iconography is supposed to or iconology is supposed to kind of draw you in a story, and then send you back out. But I don't think I have any information on why some of them are larger than others. No. Mm-mm. Yes. Well, they don't really give an argument because they're the Vatican. I think because it's a person who's preaching, but I think that what happened was when they revealed this, they just got just a swarm of women priests in the ordination, who are pushing for the ordination. They really latched onto this, and so what'd you say? They had to have sort of an explanation for it, but that'd be my best guess. There are no images that look like Jesus. There are no images that look like this that are Jesus in any other place. So, yes. That's right. Yes. Mm-hmm. Any Catholics in the house? Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's the whole thing that the women were arguing, is that this is showing you women were leading publicly, preaching and leading. And that's problematic for, yes. Yes, that's what it's, uh-huh. And it's true. You can speak to this certainly more than I could, but Jesus, it is a little Greek god-ish in these early years, because these are very Roman, very Hellenized people who are painting this. This is very early art, and so you definitely see those this goat on his neck. You definitely see these sort of pagan pieces, influences in the artwork as well. Thank you so much.